All right, we're going to launch ourselves into the next session. My name is Laura Frank. I'm joined today by Aron Altmark, Danny Firpo. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I'm going to slowly progress through our slide deck, which is being human remote controlled. Can we advance to our next slide, please? Today we're going to be talking about reality at 60 frames per second, live audience content with real-time engines. The three of us all have backgrounds in media server control, real-time engine content production, and very fast-paced, very big canvas-driven audience shows. So let's go to our next slide. I want to give these gentlemen a chance to show some of their work, talk about some of the tools they've been using on projects, and the places they've been building these systems. So we're going to talk about backgrounds and real-time content creation. Aron, I'm going to start with you. Can we go to his first slide?
Cool.
Let's look at this event. Some of you might recognize this space.
Hi, everybody. I'm Aron Altmark. I run a small creative and technical shop based in Santa Cruz over at the beach, not too far from here, called Visual Endeavors. We do a lot of Notch and Touch Designer, Unreal Engine, media server work, and generally making real-time workflows work. So I've done a lot the last year or so in a place called The Sphere.
Little venue you may have heard of?
It's small and small pixel counts. So this is actually a still from the Zach Brown Band residency we just worked on. So this is a real-time scene where you can see there's integrated iMag. We can go to the next slide. This is also from the Zach Brown show. These are all real-time looks. Two of these were done by an artist, Brett Bolton, who's a dear friend, and a great and amazing Notch artist. Danny and I actually met, I think, in like 2014 at a Notch class in the Bay Area. You can go to the next slide.
And can you remind everyone the canvas size you're working with for these real-time outputs?
Somewhere between 12 and 16K, depending on who you ask and where you're rendering it. This is from the Backstreet Boys residency, which by far one of the best shows I've ever worked on. And now my kids sing the Backstreet Boys, which is amazing. They're 2 and 7. It's hilarious. We can go to the next slide. So we also do some stuff that's not in the Sphere, thankfully. And this is from a Tiesto show that Danny and I got to collaborate on a little bit, where they wanted to do these like particle effects with moving truss and automation. And they were going to render all these looks out on site based on dialing in the truss positions. And we said, hey, like, why don't we just do this real time with real-time particle simulations that are taking real-time truss automation inputs. And it was just that simple and super fun. But it looked really great in the end. We can go to the next slide. The next couple of slides are from a really fun installation we did for an artist, Jordan Roth, in Paris at a place called the Louvre for Paris Fashion Week this last year.
Another small venue.
Small venue. Yeah. This was a integration with Disguise and Blacktracks. We used Blacktracks as we're the creative solutions provider for North America for them. It's a motion tracking system based on OptiTrack. So we embedded infrared tracking beacons into different costumes and flexible fabric pieces, and then we were feeding that position info into Disguise to real-time warp rigged meshes and then reprojecting content onto those surfaces in real time. Sorry, I said real time a lot because it was a real-time pain in the butt. Let's go to the next slide. And you can see there's this dress. There was these wings, which were crazy. You can go to the next slide again. This is also partially in daylight, which was fun to use infrared for, active infrared. But there was also a pyramid. There were some crazy surfaces. It's a really cool workflow that we're really excited to do more with in somewhat more controlled environments. But yeah, those are some samples just of things we've done in the last year or so.
Excellent. We'll hand it over to Danny to let him talk about his company, All of It Now.
Hi. Whoa.
This may need to get played. There's a video. Yep.
Yeah, right.
He's just going to talk over.
Yeah, I'll talk about this one here. There's a lot of real-time content here. All of It Now started in San Francisco, created and founded not too far away in the Mission District, went on to move to Los Angeles. But yeah, there's a lot of different shows here for Renee Rapp, Peso Pluma. There's some Bad Bunny in there. A lot of real-time shows. There were some great screens behind the scenes there of the show. There's Encanto, there's Kiss, there's Renee Rapp again, there's Linkin Park, there's a really cool real-time workflow that we created for Peso Pluma involving lighting simulation. There's the Gorillaz, there's BTS, there's Coachella, there's Melanie Martinez, there's more Encanto. All of it now is a real curse of a name because we have to kind of live up to that all the time, everywhere. There's a lot of really fun workflows in here, but Notch is kind of the primary one there. Notch, for those uninitiated, is kind of like essentially a game engine embedded into a media server as kind of like a plugin. What that means then is that you can kind of create content that is dynamic and responsive. And those last two things are really, really important for the purpose of this conversation, which is real-time content.
And I think this next video, if we can go to the next slide, is a recent project.
Yeah, this is a really fun one for the Bad Bunny tour. This was a real-time motion captured frog named Concho.
Is it playing?
And what he does is he essentially is talking to the performer on stage as well as the audience members. So there's audio in this one, but effectively, the Concho the frog is talking to the performer on stage as well as individual members of the audience, and then calling them out and saying, "Hey, you in the blue sweater, what'd you think of the show? Do you like that?" And that's kind of a moment that is really proves to the audience, it builds that trust that like this is real time. It can't be faked, right? This can't be rendered because there's an audience member in the blue shirt that the frog is talking to. And that's a really fun kind of application that we don't see a lot of because only a few years ago we were saying, don't do this. This is a really bad idea. This is going to fail spectacularly. And the technology and the trust that we build with our team members and with artists and everybody kind of is allowed to partake in this kind of project is about building trust and kind of, but also adapting the technology to do what you need it to really, really quickly.
I don't have a sample from it, but one of the first real-time projects I did was Spamalot the musical, The Magic Mirror. We actually had an actor backstage and tracking dots and a camera system, and we were going to do audience interactive, but the merch team was like, you can't do that. We're selling stuff. We need the audience to leave the venue. So we had to kill it because it looked too... the audience didn't realize it was real time, which I think is something we're going to talk about, is when you use real time and is it impactful for the effort, for the lift involved? Will the audience know or is it valuable? So let's go to the next slide. I think my favorite question to start with involves client education. When someone comes to you with a project and the clients think they need real time as a solution, what are they actually asking for? And maybe give a percentage of how often you follow through on delivering real time.
I mean, I think there's a lot of artists in the live events and concert world that come and they say, well, they see Notch specifically because Notch as a platform has gotten really hyped for like IMAG effects and, manipulating camera feeds. And so there's a lot of people that'll come to us and say, how many notches can I have? Or, I want like 5 notch looks and I want my person to be on fire in real time and like that. I think that's a fair use case and has to be real time. If you have a camera feed going in and it's responsive, it has to be real time. A lot of times I find that people are asking for, like you're saying, something that can't be faked, something that can't be pre-rendered, or something that people feel is responsive and there's that like magical element of like, how is this happening? The Snapchat filter, whatever that looks like. But then we also get people that say, I want something to be rendered real time, and maybe if you're running something to time code, and it's repeatable and it's replicable, we don't need that. Like you can pre-render it. That was real time.
And you, Danny?
Yeah, I think time code is kind of the real invisible spirit that guides a lot of our shows, right? Across the board, right? Whether it's broadcast, music, TV, film, et cetera, anything. But I think the idea is that what can we do with something that is time code is very linear, right? It goes from one frame to the next frame in a very linear fashion. When we can't be linear, right? When we has to be responsive, when it has to be dynamic, and even something like a camera filter, as an example, sometimes has to be real time because guess what? The lighting works in real time as well, and we need to adapt that filter, that look, that effect to the lighting as well as to the performer themselves. The example of like, oh well, it's a camera filter. Why don't we just use a LUT, right? That basically does just adjust our color values just a little bit to give us that red tint. And the answer is, well, the lighting doesn't stay the same, but the LUT does, right? And so suddenly that effect, that transformation of color, doesn't work well for all looks and needs to be adjusted either per song or per track or per frame even to actually align with the lighting and the audio and the pyro and everything that's happening on stage. And that kind of real-time reaction is sometimes something that we need, because either that can't be, the lighting changes every show, the lighting changes every frame, the pyro doesn't hit exactly the right moment, the performer isn't in their light, and we need to adjust the look in real time to adjust to the performer's position in real time. And so a lot of the time when we're doing real-time content, it's in reaction relation to what potentially whoever's on stage is what they're doing. And if that needs to be dynamic, and that isn't just a pre-scripted kind of pop moment where they always put their hand in the same place every time, that has to be real time.
I think that's a good segue into our next question, because it brings up that discussion. We can go to the next slide. When you are onboarding a new client or a new project and you're having these discussions about rendered versus real time, maybe they're not asking for real time, but you need to advocate for those tools because of how they're staging the show or the impacts of the live environment. Even if it's time code, the production process itself might benefit from a real-time pipeline in production, just so you can get content responding faster than going back through a rendered pipeline to deliver final files. So how do you and your teams decide between the pipeline types, between rendered and real-time, and the impacts to not only how you build your creative, but the tool sets and infrastructure you bring or demand to deliver that?
I think one thing I find is like time and the linearity and the predictability of a show and of a project tends to factor into this conversation, like especially with canvases like Sphere. You can't just kick out a render if something is wrong. And there's some of these looks that we've been asked to do where, especially the way it integrates with iMag or real-time inputs, you can't do that with a fully rendered pipeline. So in the conversation of a client comes in and says, hey, we need X, Y, or Z look, we have to look at the inputs and outputs and what that looks like. Can we do it with the traditional VFX workflow? Do we need a hybrid situation? Is it a real-time front plate with like a rendered back plate? Can we match it up with motion tracking? Can we match it up somehow so that there's a more stable real-time solution with a high fidelity pre-rendered solution? But I think this conversation of like, should it be real time is also a fun one. You know, for instance, this Tiesto show that we were talking about, like we were asked to do a rendered pipeline, but we advocated for a real time pipeline because we took the rendering completely out of the process. Like we didn't need to render it because we know that Notch and Touch Designer as our workflow could accomplish a really nice particle simulation that would have the same fidelity, and then we didn't have to have someone sit there and dial in all these truss positions and then hit render, and then, you know, it maintained the flexibility of the show and of the creative flow that they wanted, that the client wanted. I think generally we also, when we're doing real-time workflows, I should note that we're also always prepared with a pre-rendered option, because you have to have a fallback option if there's an issue. We never know what those issues can be, but like, and Danny said, like we strive to come up with these really rock-solid solutions, but also we have an obligation to our client to make sure that we're covering all the bases. And so even if on some of these, you know, projects where there's an Unreal Engine scene or something that is fully real time and it looks amazing and there's nothing that could go wrong, we always have a backplate ready to go, something that covers us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, systems fail. That's just what they do. And unfortunately, real-time content is inherently kind of reliant upon those systems to work. And when they don't, sometimes we have to either fake that input, adjust that input, have that plan B. But in terms of deciding between whether to do that in the first place and to subject ourselves to that kind of misery, why do we do it is a good question. But I think that's a philosophical, existential question. But how do we do it is, I think, the more important question. And I think like being able to put as much in real time as possible is always our preference, because it means, you know, to our, again, chagrin, that means content can be adjusted potentially later in the process than a rendered piece of content, right? Especially on these massive canvases where you have to hit render 2 weeks before the show, right? Or else it's not going to happen. If someone says, "Hey, wait, I want to change that to 7 p.m. instead of 7:05 p.m.," right? That sucks for you, because that was like that ship sailed about 2 weeks ago. And suddenly but if you're saying, well, this is a dynamic text element, we can make that adjustment up until doors, right? Suddenly that changes the dynamic and changes the whole aspect and philosophy of creation, right? Because instead of saying we are locked on creative 2 weeks before we even start the show, to say we can make adjustments after the show is opened, even, right? We don't want to do that, but we've all done that.
This becomes a bigger problem, actually. So there's a whole other conversation of how do you tell clients that real-time content, to quote Kirsten Hovland, is not real-time content creation, right? So like, no matter what, you also have to say like, yes, we can change it, but just because we can doesn't mean that pulling the string on the sweater means you're going to end up with no sweater, right? That's not good.
And I think as real-time content creation tools were becoming available, it was a very hard client education discussion point to say, just because we can make these decisions last minute doesn't mean we should be basing that as our baseline for production work. We still have to storyboard, plan, go through approvals to make this effective so that we're set up to do production with real-time tools effectively in these very short timelines. We were kind of leaning in, I think, to the liability part of this rendered versus real-time question, because there's the creative development piece, but then it's like there's shows you walk away from, and there's a high-paid team to maintain them, like with a rock tour, and then there are projects you walk away from permanently, and there's building services maintaining your real-time architecture. And I just want to lean in a little bit to that question. Will that impact your choice? Are those real-time tools ready for permanent install?
Short answer, yes. Long answer is, I find that in the less hands-on support is going to be, the more middleware and the more protections you have to put in place to ensure that like things are going to start up the same way, that there's not a graphics driver that gets updated on some machine somewhere that then borks your background subtraction, which is integral to the project, or there's a lot more components to validate and a lot more QC that has to go into that. I think for long-term install and also for this like whole experiential realm, which we're also pushing into a lot of fun things with, I find that real-time is definitely ready and something that we want to leverage, but it does take a lot more. It does take a lot more curation and like running machines for weeks at a time to see what happens when buffers fill up and when something doesn't restart correctly, and when one of the depth sensors, we just had this with a project where like one of our depth sensors just like wouldn't come back online the same way every time. And it was like, it turned out to be a cable issue. And it was a really noodly thing, but it took us weeks to get through it. And so, yeah, when you don't have 7 people with their hands on the servers, it can be a whole thing.
Thoughts about that yourself, Danny?
Yeah, the specialty or specialization or skill set of the crew is absolutely part of the recipe of will this work, and it doesn't make the most sense, because if the person day-to-day operating this thing doesn't know how it works, then the potential for that to be misconfigured increases exponentially with real-time content, because they put the wrong value in somewhere that requires a specific value and suddenly it doesn't work. The same could be said for real-time content, right? If they pull the plug on a piece of content that's playing back, then it's not going to work either. But that's one thing that can go wrong versus 10 things that can go wrong in the real-time content process. So I think it, just like any specialized tool, it works well when the person knows what they're doing. But I think that oftentimes that's out of your control, and that's sometimes out of their control. I think we've kind of done installs with studios where we don't know who we're handing it off to. We kind of have to assume a very low level of skill, and then we come out and it's even lower, and we're like, oh my God. But I think the other part is, how to hand off to a specialized operator takes just as much skill, because sometimes they're so skilled that they think that they know better than you, and you're having to play this game, right, of, well, that's not built that way for that reason, and you're having to kind of have that conversation as well.
These platforms go so deep that you may know pieces and parts of it and use a tool in a way that is completely foreign to the people who end up maintaining a show, so that's a really good point. Let's go ahead. I think we're going to skip the next question because we kind of talked about pixel counts. I want to talk about this piece, creative superpowers, because we hinted at this, and I think it's worth exploring. Why do teams choose the pain of real-time pipelines at all?
I think like we're, especially in live shows and concerts, we're in this kind of arms race of like, who can make the coolest show, and that kind of bar is raised every hour at this point because there's just so many amazing teams. So in some ways, it's how can I make my show different from somebody else's? How can I add some of my own personality as an artist into this show is always, I think, a real choice. But I think that sometimes it's a necessity in terms of I want to do this special gag where a giant frog talks to the audience, and that can only happen live. And I think that spirit of it can only happen live is partially what I think attracted a lot of us to that business in the first place, is that kind of magic moment that happens in shows that inspire us to keep doing them. And that, as we get into this realm of pre-canned, time-coded content that we see on a loop, we get closer to the reality that we're trying to escape from a lot of the time when we go to these shows, right? We want to see something that's spontaneous and magical and can only be captured in a brief moment of time. And we kind of want to put that ethos and vibe into exactly what it is that we're doing every day and share that with the artists as well.
Yeah, I think also one thing I find is after looking back, let's look back 5 years-ish, during COVID and during the time when live entertainment was shut down, virtual production became the thing. And all of the software and hardware teams in the industry put their entire weight behind VP and extended reality. And so we spent better part of 3 or 4 years in studios doing virtual production and using Unreal Engine and Notch and all these workflows for real-time backplates and real-time worlds, because we could do in-camera VFX. And I would also argue that we had so much time during those shoots to sit in a studio and tweak things and watch Unreal crash and watch, ourselves pull our hair out and wonder why we were doing this. But coming out of that, the whole industry now had this familiarity with Unreal and real-time workflows, and we're like, cool, now let's like flip that back and do the cool stuff in live concerts. And then we were like, oh God, no, we don't have the time to do this on stages and in a lot of these like load-ins where they're very short and we're trying to do things with a lot more inputs and outputs and a lot of variables. And so what I found is like the conversation with clients of should we do it real time and like why are we looking for that kind of comes back to a lot of our experiences as professionals of saying like we know what the liabilities are and what the pain involved there is, because real time is still, it's very cool and it is way more capable than it ever was, and also hardware has continued to get better. And also like we have to know what is a reasonable and feasible thing to put up on a stage in a live environment and what we can do in different deployments. Like we have people on site right now actually for a worship client where they're doing some very, very ambitious Unreal worlds that are reimagining like ancient cities. And I was talking to them this morning and it's like they're having very base level, issues of like render nodes and shared DDS caches and all kinds of things that there are a lot of blockers that are far from creative that we run into. And so it's really just what does it unlock creatively? Like I think there's a lot that it unlocks creatively. It's really up to us to figure out whether that technical and creative balance is there and when we can push it.
And it's going to be supported.
Right, and when it's going to be supported. I said recently regrettably to a client, I said, sometimes we're standing on the bleeding edge and sometimes we're standing in a pool of our own blood and we just want to keep it to the point where we're not on the other side, right? Like it's a thing. Don't ever say that to a client.
To the client.
Yeah.
Before or after the
fine.
check
The show went fine,
clear.
guys. Don't worry. It was a really good thing. But I was trying to explain. They were like, "Why does this take so long?" And I'm like, well, "What do you mean? Like this is extremely complex." And they're like, "No, it looks easy. You make it look easy." It's like, well, that's great. We have a bunch of smart people behind computers.
That's a great segue to the last question. I think we can just sneak this in, which is about myth busting. And I think that is the heart of what we do as professionals when we make it look easy, and the complexity that we sometimes hide, I think needs to get bubbled up to the surface. I will also include that the organization you see mentioned here, Framework, it is a community of people in this practice who are actively trying to learn from each other, the different disciplines we occupy, our different approach to creative video environments, and doing that important work of client education, as well as mentorship of the next generation of people coming into our practice. So tell us, what does real time not mean? And we'll give over the stage.
I think continuing the blood and edge and real just metal kind of thing. I think real time is a double-edged sword, right? That it can mean amazing things, right? But at the same time, a phrase that was spoken to me early in the process was real time takes a long time, right? Sometimes rendered content is actually faster, and that's a really, again, don't say that to a client, but sometimes real-time content is faster, right? Because at the end of the day, or rendered content is faster because you can spend as long as you want on lighting, right? Because it's rendered, and if it takes a little bit longer, right, it's a couple of extra milliseconds of render time, not a big deal. But in real-time content, every millisecond counts because you're relying upon the actual video card to process data at that speed, and not just a video card, right? It's potentially 5 other interconnected systems before it even hits the video card that are essentially need to be in sync in order to work. So real time can take a long time in terms of needing to work through all of those systems with potentially 4 or 5 different vendors that are all needing to speak the same language, in terms of actual language and then computer language as well. And in order to actually synchronize all those systems together, it can take a long time, and it can take a lot of process of optimization and all the stuff that a render artist doesn't necessarily have to do. They still have to do some optimization. Obviously, the render can't take a million years to render a cube, but at the same time, they have a little bit more headroom in terms of the scene performance and then what it can look like and what they can do behind the scenes to essentially make it look as beautiful as possible. But sometimes in real-time content, there's that negotiation between performance and quality, where we can make it look a certain way, but we can't make it look as good as a render that took 4 weeks to do, because we have 16 milliseconds in which to do it, and not 4 weeks. So I think that is always that negotiation between time, quality, performance, and ultimately budget too. Of sometimes real time is chosen not because it's the best tool for the job, but because it's the only tool for the job, because the 2-week window to render that content was 2 weeks ago, and now we have to do it real time.
So let's go to the last slide. This is how you can get in touch with us. If you have further questions, find us around the museum for the day. We look forward to talking with you more. Thanks, guys, for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.